This week on Inside Olympia, Washington's Office of Independent Investigations is about to begin investigating deaths at the hands of police, but only in one of 6 regions of the state. What are the ongoing challenges to standing up this first-in-the-nation office? We get an update from Director Roger Rogoff.
From the TBW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. In 2021, the Washington legislature created a first-in-the-nation Office of Independent Investigations to investigate cases of police use of deadly force. But setting up that office, hiring and training the staff, and putting it all in place, the infrastructure, the staffing, the policies, the procedures, has taken longer than expected. Now, 3 years in, the office says beginning this December, it will start to respond to fatal encounters with police in one of 6 regions of the state. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, for an update on the Office of Independent Investigations is its director, former prosecutor and former King County judge, Roger Rogoff. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good to be here. And it's an annual check-in, and each time we talk, you're moving the ball down the field. You're constructing something from nothing and trying to create something that can respond to arguably some of the most serious incidents that this state and communities will experience. So what's the top line, the headline, as we talk in 2024?
We are gratified that we will begin to respond to new incidents of deadly use of force by police beginning on December 1st at 12:01 a.m. That is the date we will begin a staggered launch of our statewide investigations, beginning in what we call Region 1, which is the region that stretches from Clark County, the Oregon border, up through Thurston County, and then through the peninsula up to Jefferson and Clallam counties. And so it includes 12 counties altogether, which is about a third of the state, if you're counting by counties. And we just feel like it's the culmination of a whole lot of incredibly hard work. It's really historic, given that an investigative agency like this has never existed in the United States, one that is completely independent of any police agency, independent of any prosecutor agency, independent of any attorney general's office. It really stands on its own underneath the governor's office and will do its work without the help of commissioned police officers or anyone connected to law enforcement.
And we should sort of pause and take note of the significance of this fact that you're actually going to stand up at least one of the regions, because as we've talked about in the past, there were times when you couldn't even say when that would happen. You weren't prepared to give a date specific because you didn't want to say something and then not be able to meet that self-imposed deadline. So what has changed? What's happened in the intervening years since we last spoke to allow for this? What came together?
Well, there are a number of things, but the primary building block we had to put in place was having the human resources to do the work, and primarily hiring the investigators who can get on the ground, respond to scenes, and do the investigative work that's necessary. We've talked about before that is a difficult lift. Law enforcement agencies across the state have trouble hiring right now. We are a niche organization. It's a different organization, but uses some of the same skills that law enforcement officers and certainly detectives in law enforcement agencies use. And so getting that hiring done has always been the major barrier. We've also had to build policies and procedures and how we're going to do the work. We've had to put together the infrastructure and just get the stuff that we're going to need in order to do the work. And finally, we need to train our folks in order to make sure that they are just like anybody else doing a homicide investigation across the state of Washington. And if and when they are ever in a courtroom, that they can describe their training, describe their experience, and have it be something credible.
Why this particular region?
Mostly it has to do with where resources are located. In fact, that's primarily what it is. We began hiring. We offered these positions of investigator, senior investigator, and regional supervisor across the state in a number of different venues. We recruited both here in Washington State and also nationally. And we hired the people that fit the bill and were the most qualified and really exceptional people that we've put together. And it just so happens that most of them are right now residing in Region 1 or around Region 1. And if we are going to respond to incidents, we need our folks to be close to where those incidents might occur. And that's how we've sort of made that decision. However, we are incredibly cognizant of the concern that folks in other regions of the state have. Certainly, I've heard from folks on the east side and folks in the north and so forth, and they very much want, particularly community members, very much want this agency to be open in their region as well. And we very much want to make that happen for them. And we are working very hard to focus our recruiting so that we can open statewide in a staggered way, one region after the other.
So I'm sure you're anticipating this question and not loving this question, but what, if you think about the staggered rollout here, do you have a timeline at this point for regions 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6?
I think the answer is the same as it was whenever we talk, which is I don't want to give timelines because I'm concerned about not being able to meet them. I don't think it will. I know it will not take nearly as long as this first iteration has taken. We will be able to do it faster because we have more people in place. And we have people in Region 1, which I just talked about. We have folks who live in Region 2, which is Pierce County, Region 3, which is King County. And we've also hired some folks out in the central area of Washington and also out on the east side near Spokane.
Is there going to be some value? I would imagine that as soon as Region 1 is responding and starting to do investigations, there's going to be an immediate feedback loop that will also inform what goes on in those other regions. So do you have a feeling or a sense that you want to see how it's going for a few months before you then say stand up Region 2?
Yeah, I maybe somewhat, but I don't want it to sound like this is an experiment or a test case. We are going to open because we are ready to open, and we expect these investigations to be done well. I think some of the feedback loop may simply be how are we interacting with the law enforcement agencies that are out there right now doing the work? How is community responding to what we're doing? How is our relationship with impacted families whose loved ones were killed? And certainly we will always learn from whatever we do and do it better. But I don't think the idea is, okay, we're going to open in Region 1, see how it goes, and then see where we do it next. We intend to open in the next region when we are ready to do it because we have the resources to do it there.
Okay. I do want to ask you a number of questions about how this is going to work in Region 1, but let's just step back in big picture. Last year when we spoke, you had, I think, 32 staff on board, including 11 investigators. Where do things stand now in terms of standing up and staffing this organization?
We have approximately 52 total employees at this point. We have about 25 investigators across the state of different levels. And you'll remember when we've talked that our investigators are sort of tiered. We have our regional supervisors who are the folks who are going to put together the resources for each investigation, make sure that people are in the right places. They will also respond. They will ensure that the investigations are done efficiently and effectively. We have the senior investigators, and these are folks who have experience doing homicide investigations and or officer-involved use of force investigations. They are people who are going to be able to hit the ground running, do the work immediately. And it was really important to hire these people, most of whom are former law enforcement. And it's important to do that because we want to get up and running quickly. We want to be able to train people and then get people out on the street to do this. And then we have our third tier, which are our investigators who come from a number of different backgrounds. Lots of them did civil investigative work within the state. Some were in the military. Some were some were crime scene investigators, but not commissioned law enforcement officers. A lot of different backgrounds, and they need a full training regimen before they're ready to go out and do the work. And so having those three sort of tiers allows us to slowly build our non-former law enforcement group and make that bigger. And as they get ready and are able to respond to scenes, they become senior investigators and they train the next group of investigators. So that's sort of the idea.
So the investigators are obviously the tip of the spear here, key to the ability to respond. There are also, as part of this agency, family liaisons and tribal liaisons. What's the status of standing up those entities?
So we've been very fortunate to hire a good portion of our family liaison group. We have a supervisor who runs it, and we have at least one family liaison who's on board with her. They will be providing support and resources, or at least a direction for resources to impacted family members. One of the concerns that led to the creation of this agency was that impacted families felt like they were sort of left out of the loop, didn't know what was going on, and would hear about things much later in the process. Hopefully the existence of these family liaisons ends that problem, and those folks feel like they are at least part of the process from the beginning. Mm-hmm. We also have hired our tribal liaison supervisor and one tribal liaison. We have one person on the east side, one person on the west side. They have begun the outreach process with all of the tribes in the state. It has been incredibly successful. We are getting great feedback from tribal nations that our insistence on going out and meeting them and building relationships and making sure that each of us know what's going to happen if there's ever an incident that impacts tribal lands or tribal people, what will happen, and that's been incredibly successful. And then finally, we've hired our community liaison, who is going to help us with outreach to communities and ensuring that community representatives and communities themselves are kept up to date on our investigations as they occur.
Okay. Is it fair to say, and when you're at full staffing for this agency, where do you think you'll be?
Initially, we were staffed for 79. We are asking for additional staffing at the legislature this year. I think we're probably looking at closer to 100 plus total. One of the things we learned in doing outreach, particularly with law enforcement agencies, is that the number of people we need available to respond in a region is much bigger than the people we actually need to respond, right? Because people can't be on call 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. People get sick, people go on vacation. And so we are going to need more people than probably was initially thought about. And so we'll be going to the legislature and asking for those resources.
I have in my notes here that eventually you're looking at 60 to 80 investigators. Is that?
I think that's fair.
And so to that end, is it fair to say that you are now sort of a quarter to a third of the way there? Is that a way to think about that?
I think that's fair. One other thing we've done to minimize the use of resources and allow us to get started early is, instead of thinking about it in terms of all of the investigators who respond to a Region 1 incident having to be in Region 1, certainly people in Pierce County can respond to a Region 1 incident. Certainly people in King County can respond to a Pierce County incident. And so we have, I think, loosened the reins a little bit on where people are and when they can respond to an incident. So we're going to try and crash as many folks as is feasible to those scenes.
I want to ask just about the geographic scope of that Region 1, which you described as stretching from the Olympic Peninsula down into coastal Washington, southwest coastal Washington, and then over into along the Columbia River. So I think Skamania County maybe is the outside border of that. Right. So when time is of the essence, what is your thinking about the ability to get to, what if one of these incidents happens in Neah Bay or Port Angeles or in rural Skamania County, and crime scenes, they age quickly? What is the thinking about how quickly you can get folks to some of these outer portions of this region?
So we believe we can get people there roughly in the same time frame as the current independent investigative teams are able to get there in full.
And those are regional in nature too.
They are. They are a little bit closer geographically. A couple things we have done to make that easier is we've requested an exemption from the Washington State Patrol to allow us to use lights and sirens, not blue lights like law enforcement officers, but red and white lights, in order to allow us to get to these incidents quicker and make sure we don't have someone who's deceased laying out on the street for any length of time, make sure that evidence is taken care of quickly, make sure that we don't lose witnesses. We also understand that there are going to be times where those independent investigative teams might get there first, and we'll need to do some work initially to make sure we don't lose evidence, don't lose witnesses. And I think there's an acknowledgement in the statute that that might happen. And certainly we have talked to law enforcement who have been very willing to assist in that way when necessary. Nobody wants those scenes to be degraded in any way. And so everyone's going to work to make sure they're not. And then when we arrive, there'll be a handoff and we'll take over the scene.
And you've previously explained that these regional teams that exist now and were actually created by initiative are not going away. Their role is going to evolve, but they will still exist. So I'm curious, again, just sort of step back. How do you think you're going to be feeling at 12:01 a.m. on the, did you say it's the 1st or the 2nd of December?
First.
What will you be? I don't know if you'll wake up at that point, but the stakes are very high here. And so I guess I just wonder if you're going to be nervous. Are you going to be, what do you think?
I think overall we are all very intensely working toward this date. And so there is going to be some feeling of readiness and a desire to get this right. And I think people are keyed up in that way. But then again, I was a prosecutor for a long time. I was an assistant U.S. attorney for a long time. I've responded to scenes in my life. I've been on call. And I know it's a whole lot of waiting and nothing. So I will probably be okay. I'll probably be sleeping on December 1st at 12:01, hopefully, and hoping that I don't get woken up. And of course, we would hope that we never get a call. Maybe there's no need for us at all. But I think we're going to be ready, but calm and focused, and that's my hope for the entire agency.
As the director of this agency, do you plan to respond to the first call out yourself?
I will probably head out there for the first couple just to see it, to answer questions. I'm sure there'll be a lot of curiosity, and just to be present and a source of support for my employees, my staff, and my investigators.
What is the status of getting office space for these different regions and equipment that, I think we've talked about whether you need drones, you certainly need the vehicles, you need computers that can go with the vehicles, crime scene equipment.
So it's funny you mentioned that. I was just today, we were at our headquarters over here at the RAD building, which is about a block away from your studio. And a bunch of my investigators and senior investigators were down on the street level, and our very first evidence van was fully loaded and upfitted with all of the equipment that they need to receive and process evidence, transport it to wherever it needs to go, be used as a command center if necessary, depending on where we are and what we're doing. And all those folks were sort of scurrying around in and out of the van, and it was exciting for me to see all the work being done and all the things that have been accomplished. But we have been working at it. It's one of the things that was a priority, is to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, and certainly things like drones for crime scene mapping, a records management system, communication devices, the ability to have mobile Wi-Fi, mobile service so that we can do the work and the records management we need to while it's happening, in addition to all of the investigatory tools that you need to do this work, fingerprint kits, DNA kits, ballistics kits, All of those things have to be procured. And then the thing that people forget is that everything you create, everything that you bring in, everything that you do has to be supported by policies so that it's all done in the same way every time. So that work has been ongoing, and I don't think I fully appreciated when I started doing this job just how time-intensive and how work-intensive that is. It's just support, like I know as a former prosecutor, former sort of quasi-investigator, that I need X, Y, and Z. But whenever I have had X, Y, and Z in my work in the past, that has already been supported
The
by
infrastructure's
the
in
policies.
place.
Everything's in place.
Yeah.
It's easy. We're now creating it, which is different, and it's exciting, but it's hard.
Who actually does the policies? Do you have an assistant attorney general who works with you, or who writes this?
So every agency in the state of Washington is supported by an assistant attorney general, but our policies are being done internally. You know, we don't work for the AG, so we're doing our own policies. I have a senior legal and policy advisor who is a former King County deputy prosecutor, senior deputy prosecutor who was in their homicide unit, who's very comfortable with this kind of work of going out to scenes and has sort of seen it all. And she is doing a lot of the work along with our director of investigations, who's a former public defender and has seen it from the other side. And sort of that sort of balance in figuring out how we're going to do this work, how we're going to create our policies is one of the things that we wanted.
Who do you guys consult with? Like, you're not doing this in a vacuum, obviously. For instance, are these independent teams serving as consultants when you guys have a question or wonder, how do you guys do this, and is it working well, and what would you do differently?
Sure. I think there's a couple answers to that. Early on, before I ever got here, there were certainly some consultants who had done similar work in Canada, for instance. We had a consultant who ran an IIT up in Bremerton, who actually still works for us. And we had other consultants that we worked with. Since I came on board and we've been hiring people, we certainly do outreach. And that outreach is to law enforcement agencies, because there's some just basic investigative stuff we do that cuts across all kinds of agencies. We have reached out to the IITs who currently do the work. We've been really careful about that. We want to use what they can provide to us in terms of how they do the work, but we also don't want to be them. We want to do the work the way that our statute tells us to do the work. And then we also have done a lot of outreach to communities and taken from them what they will tell us about how our work has been done well and how it hasn't been done well in the past. So we've done a lot of outreach, and that outreach has really informed the policies that we've created.
How do you think that will then inform the way that these teams show up at the scenes? And I think every time I talk to you, I ask you to sort of imagine it's late at night, it's dark, it's raining, it's 40 degrees out, time is of the essence. And yet you are trying to approach these scenes differently, I guess, maybe in a way that is more respectful of the family of the deceased person, or at least keeping them in mind in a way that historically perhaps hasn't been front and center. You're approaching this from an anti-racism, kind of pro-equity approach, but the nature of the work is you go at all hours. The conditions often aren't ideal. It's going to be often highly charged. So how do you think these teams will show up?
Well, I think the statute really says it well. And if you read the statute, it says the nuts and bolts of how you do an investigation doesn't really change. And that's a hard thing to change. You collect evidence, you talk to witnesses, you canvass the area, you collect the video. What is going to be different is who's there and how they show up, not in uniform, not carrying weapons, with an eye toward really doing a thoughtful, balanced, complete investigation that both community and law enforcement can trust and believe in. And I think that makes a difference. I think the addition of the family liaison, to help with the impacted family members and to make sure that they are not left out of the process.
By
is
the way, are they
incredibly
supposed to
important.
respond to the scene, the family liaison, or does that depend?
We're still working on that, and the answer right now is probably it depends. And I don't think we've gotten to the bottom yet as to exactly how that's gonna look.
So the fact that they're showing up, are they wearing any sort of uniform? Is it going to be?
There, we do have some OII emblazoned shirts. We have, they'll look professional, and they'll all look relatively similar. They'll have OII stuff on, so they'll be identifiable. But it's not a uniform in the way that folks think about it. They will also wear vests for their protection, so you'll be able to tell they're the official people at the scene. It'll just look a little different.
I want to ask about this goes back, sticking with the theme of how to approach these scenes. One of the things that emerged from the death of Manny Ellis in Tacoma is that it seemed like a lot of evidence came to light some time after his death, like weeks, months after, including, if I recall correctly, doorbell videos, eyewitnesses. And the impression that was left is that the initial investigation wasn't terribly thorough. And I'm just wondering if cases like that and others, how those might be informing the thinking about, I talked about responding the night of or the day of, but the follow-on investigation in the days to come, so that you're not missing something that seems so obvious but has been missed in the past.
And certainly the Ellis investigation occurred before we ever existed, so I don't know enough about the internals of what happened to comment on it. But I will say that the idea of OII is to do the same thorough investigation for every single case. It's gonna look the same. Even if it is the most straightforward-looking case when you walk on the scene and everyone says, really, this is simple, here's what happened, you can just tell by looking. We are going to do the full investigation every single time. Every case is going to get our full attention, is going to get our full resources, is going to get all the time necessary to make sure that we know exactly what happened, the family knows exactly what happened, and the law enforcement agency that was involved knows exactly what happened. And when we do that, we're going to write a report that describes all of that and describes the full description of our investigation itself. We want to end the questions about what the facts are. I think that is the best service we can give as this new agency. We're never going to end the speculation of what should have happened and could have happened and who was right and who was wrong. What we can end is this dual set of facts or triple set of facts that sometimes exist now. We want to be trusted enough that when we say, here's what happened and here's how we figured out what happened, that people learn to trust that because we're doing it the same every single time.
Okay. We're going to take a brief break. When we return, we continue our in-depth interview with Roger Rogoff, Director of the State Office of Independent Investigations. Back after this.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Washington State is not missing high-speed police pursuits. Washington State is missing the possibility of a high-speed pursuit.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Roger Rogoff, the Director of the Washington State Office of Independent Investigations, charged with investigating police deadly force incidents. I'm curious if your observation about the acceptance of this office, especially in the part of law enforcement. This is something that has had to be socialized to some extent. Do you sense any greater acceptance or comfort level 3 years in, and as you prepare to actually start doing these investigations? Or is there still a lot of resistance?
I think it's varied. There is acceptance. The way I've described it to people is when we initially started, there was a lot of questions when we would present to law enforcement about why. And I think there are much fewer questions about why now and much more questions about how. How are you going to do this? How are you going to make this work with what is already in place? How are our IITs going to do work? What's that going to look like? And while that's a better place to be in, of them asking how, it's also really difficult also. They have great questions. They've been doing this for a long time, and we want to make sure that we're able to take the information that they provide us and give those better answers every time we go out and talk to them. And I think that's happening. I think if you talk to folks in law enforcement, they will tell you that the one thing that's true about OII since they started is that it has been really receptive to providing information, has been really transparent, really willing to talk to folks. Anyone who has a question in law enforcement about what we're doing, how we're doing it, when we're going to do it, they will get an answer. There's no hiding anything on our part. We want to be honest brokers in the work that we do around them. I would also say, Austin, that the idea that the questions about our effectiveness only come from law enforcement, I don't think is accurate. We get just as many really difficult and legitimate questions from the community as well, from reform activists, from people who helped build this agency to start with, who have questions about how we're doing our work, whether we're going to be able to do it, and why we're going to do it. And we want to be just as responsive to them as well.
And I've asked you in the past about the fact that the nature of this is that a lot of people who are doing the work are going to be former law enforcement, and you've explained that that's a necessity because of the training required and the efforts that this office is going through to make sure that there is that this doesn't have the same pitfalls that this legislation in this office grew out of, which was the sense that there was too much adjacency, or that it was cops investigating cops.
And certainly that's what we are trying to accomplish. One of the built-in defenses to that is that the statute requires that our advisory board approve the hiring of anyone who's been in law enforcement for 24 months prior to their application to our office. And our advisory board is incredibly diverse and has folks who are impacted family members, has folks who are law enforcement, and everything in between. And that check has been real and has been helpful to us in conducting our interviews and conducting our hiring process, and in making sure that we are getting folks who not only want to investigate stuff, but want to investigate this and want to do it because they want it to be better, and they want to build a better trust and build a better system between the community and the folks who do these investigations.
I want to move through several topics fairly quickly and just clarification on a few things. When the final report is issued, will there be a recommendation? It goes to the county prosecutor, is that right? And it will be made public. Will there be a recommendation on whether there should be charges or not?
There won't be. We talked about this a lot early on and finally made a policy decision that the prosecutor has a hard enough decision in making the call on whether or not there is a criminal charge or not. They don't need us, we don't have to make that decision in the end. They don't need us helping them one way or the other. And it would be a terrible situation if we said X should happen and the prosecutor who has to actually try the case says no, Y should happen. And we want to make sure that there's no inconsistency there.
And also, is it fair to say that while that will be a question that needs to be answered by the prosecutor, that the purpose of these investigations and these reports is not just to answer that question, but to answer the question of what happened and to shed light on an incident, even when charges aren't referred or appropriate?
Absolutely. I think that we hear from community and from law enforcement all the time that transparency and understanding what happened is so important in these cases. And whatever happens with the potential criminal charge, people want to know what happened. And people want to be able to hold their officials responsible if that's necessary. And they want to make sure that if their law enforcement officials are doing a great job, that they know that as well. And so we want to give as much information as we possibly can.
There was an issue that was raised about officers who give compelled statements as part of the investigation, but those can't be used in your investigations, and needing a firewall to make sure you're not getting information that comes across the transom that they were compelled, because they can't self-incriminate, obviously, in a criminal context. What process have you set up now to ensure that that doesn't end up in the hands of your investigators?
Sure. So the same situation exists now for the independent investigative teams. Those folks doing a criminal investigation can't have those compelled statements. And so they simply set up a system where if the involved agency is taking compelled statements from their officers so that they can do their internal administrative investigation, they simply won't get those statements from that involved agency. And they also have to make sure that any other statements made by officers that maybe are public or made public also are not coming as a result of the officer being compelled to make the statement. There are going to be situations where officers assert their garrity rights, as it's called, or their Fifth Amendment rights, where they are not subject to a criminal charge, which is not going to happen. And we will work with the local prosecutors to make sure that we get the statements that we're entitled to, and that we don't get the statements that we don't want to taint the investigation.
Okay. Last year, you told me that you were asking of the 2024 legislature for some changes to the statute. One was a change in dates because the dates were kind of out of date. I presume you got that. The ability to get information without a warrant from the 911 systems, and then also this issue of not being able to share information with an involved agency that might be investigating like an underlying crime that led to the incident. So what ended up happening with those requests?
So the bill that we proposed was passed by the legislature. It was passed on a bipartisan basis. I think Democrats and Republicans voted for that bill in the end. We were able to create a situation where if there is an underlying crime that also needs to be investigated along with the use of deadly force incident, and that criminal matter is urgent, or there's evidence that's going to be lost, or there's a safety issue, that in those limited circumstances we can share information with the investigating agency or the involved agency. And so there's a little bit of leeway there. And we appreciate the legislature hearing our concerns and passing that legislation the first year we presented it, which was terrific.
You had also said that you would be asking for additional funding for centralized evidence, I think storage or space, and equipment for cars and for more investigators. Did you get that?
We got some of that. We, as often happens with money and resources, we didn't get everything that we need, and certainly we are asking the legislature during this session to ensure that we can open statewide within a reasonable amount of time, that we are able to get the human resources and also the infrastructure things that we need in order to open statewide.
Do you have that centralized evidence storage space?
We have a provisional storage space that we're going to use starting in December. We also have a new headquarters and full centralized evidence facility that we are just finishing the lease on and beginning the work on the building to make sure that it is appropriate for what we need it for. And we expect to have that up and going sometime in late 2025. So the answer is yes. Yeah. We're just doing it in two different ways.
Okay. You had said previously that in a typical year there might be 25 to 40 deadly incidents where someone dies at the hands of police. And you had said that even though the enacting statute allows you to investigate non-fatal incidents, for the time being you'll just be investigating fatal incidents. I'm curious about you mentioned needing more investigators than maybe originally imagined because of people being gone, just the sort of logistics of it. But with that number of cases, potentially over a year, the workload is going to build up pretty quickly. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about what kind of, the staffing level you need to keep ahead of the work. Again, hoping it's not 40, hoping it's 0, but knowing that reality is, historically, you're between 25 and 40 once you get statewide.
And I think that that's going to be the key, is we want to get to statewide first. I want to see exactly what that looks like, and what that workload looks like. You have to imagine that when our investigators respond to a scene, just like when law enforcement does, it's a huge response. Yeah. and then it dwindles pretty quickly as the initial investigative work kind of diminishes, and then just the follow-up is left. So you go from maybe you send 18 people to a scene, they do work for the first 6 hours, then it drops down to 10 or so, and then eventually you've got 2 investigators who are doing all the follow-up work. So that those numbers sort of dwindle,
Yeah.
and I think that there will be resources available to do more, but our I think what we want to do is get up and running with the fatalities statewide first, and then think about increasing the non-fatalities.
I think what I was also getting at is just caseload, right? We often talk about that in terms of criminal defense attorneys. We talk about it in terms of state child protection workers. It's one thing if you come into work and you have one case on your desk, but once you have 6, and then, we just got another call out, I get to see that could start to get overwhelming really quickly.
It could. I am hopeful that if we get the funding that we are seeking, that we've thought about this well enough that we can handle it. One of the nice things is that unlike a homicide unit who currently is doing these cases, we don't have a bunch of other homicide cases. We don't have a bunch of robbery cases and burglary cases to deal with. These are the things that we get to focus on. These are the cases we get to become experts on, and hopefully that lessens the impact of the caseload on us a little bit.
What is the timeline ideally from responding to an incident to actually having a report done?
So the statute gives us 120 days with the option of informing our advisory board that we need a little bit more time in case something happens. And usually that would be because we're waiting for information from a lab.
And sometimes you have to wait quite a long time for lab results.
Sometimes one of the nice things we have is we have a little bit of priority with the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. We are giving them some funding so that they give us some priority with our cases. Hopefully that speeds us up a little bit, but certainly, our cases are going to have to wait the appropriate amount of time so that other cases can have their work done as well.
What about the working with county coroners and medical examiners?
I'm glad you asked that. Sometimes I forget how much work we've done in the last 2 years, but one of the things we've done is we've gone out to, we've begun meeting with every coroner, every medical examiner in the state. Our family liaisons actually are doing a lot of work with them because family notification is connected to what those folks do in addition to everything else they do. And it's really important for our family liaisons to understand that dynamic with each medical examiner, each coroner. So we've been doing a lot of work
They're
with
the
them.
ones that release identity of, it's not the police, it's the coroner or the medical examiner who actually cause of death, manner of death, and then identity, I think.
Yes, they do that.
Yeah. So developing relationships and building some connectivity with these is part of this process.
It has, and we figured that out early on and have been working really hard to do it.
When we last spoke, there was one of the things your office was starting to do is look backs at cases where new evidence was coming to light or might have come to light. And the case that we discussed was the Andrea Cherna case from Redmond. So the question I have is just what ended up happening with that? At that point, you explained you were looking at it but had not decided whether there was enough new evidence to justify essentially reopening it.
Yeah, we've been in good contact with the family who submitted that case to us. That case is still under what we call our formal review, so sort of in the same place it was last time officially. And what we have just learned is that these cases are really complicated legally. Making sure that Garrity information does not seep into our criminal investigation is really difficult with those because most of those cases have been through an inquest, a civil lawsuit, and a lot of, so there's a lot of legal stuff that's happened. And so when we start collecting paperwork to figure out what the prosecutor had, what is actually new evidence, what isn't new evidence, it's unbelievably complicated and has taken a lot more time than we thought it would. So that case remains in a formal review stage, and hopefully we'll have a decision out relatively soon.
That, though, it's been about a year. I think you said at the time you'd like, if my notes are correct, you'd like that also to be in the 120-day timeline. Yep. So, and I imagine this is frustrating for everybody involved. Are there some lessons at this point then? If like, oh, this is more complicated than we thought, is there some way out of this thicket? Or is this just the reality of how this is going to be?
Well, I think that one of the main issue that came up was the issue with the Garrity statements and having to create a structure so that we don't cross over that evidence, and then having to create policies around that. So we sort of had to wait a little bit. We had to create the policies, and then we have to live by those policies.
So this almost provided like a test case to be like, where are our gaps here?
Yeah,
But if you can get with those systems in place, you think it'll help expedite in the future?
I don't think our intention was for this to be a test case. I think we're ready to go. This was just a piece that we didn't anticipate would be as complicated as it was, and so it took some time. I think one of the things that we've done with the Cherna case and all of these cases is work really hard to communicate with the families and to communicate with the people involved so that they understand where we are in the process and what we're trying to accomplish.
In terms of the access to the information that these teams are going to need to do their work, are there barriers that you're seeing at this point? Anything that still needs to be worked out, either in terms of that warm handoff, in terms of getting information from police departments and 911 centers, all the moving parts and pieces so that your investigators can have a full picture?
I think that work will continue to happen, yes, because every law enforcement agency is different. Every law enforcement agency handles that work differently. Every IIT in the state handles that work a little bit differently. Yeah. So making sure that we understand what each IIT does to do those handoffs, what they require, what they expect, is part of the outreach that we continue to do. Now that we've identified Region 1 as the first region where we're opening, our regional supervisor in that region has been doing an incredible amount of work of outreach to the agencies in that region and the IITs in that region to make sure that at the operational level, down on the street level, that we're having those conversations now rather than in the middle of the night after December 1st. So yeah, we're continuing to work on them, and the right people are in there doing it.
I want to just go back to the final reports again and sort of level set about what expectations here. You said there will not be a recommendation about whether there's appropriate to file criminal charges. Will there be conclusions about whether policies were met or violated on the part of the officers that were involved?
There will be a full description of what policies that particular officer or agency was living under. There will be a full description of what they actually did. We're going to strive not to directly draw conclusions and allow the prosecutors to do that. But it will be clear what the policies were and what the actions were.
Because one of the issues that came up, I think, in the Manny Ellis case was a finding on the part of the police chief that the officers had not violated their department's own policy because at the time this had to do with the restraints being used. The policy has subsequently changed, but at the time, and I think that can be difficult for the community. They're saying, either it's not allowed today or other departments wouldn't allow this particular tactic, or it would be a violation in another department, and trying to sort that out. But you guys will have to be working with each agency's policies, and they can differ.
Certainly, and those policies for them are public, and they are things that we can get, things that our statute gives us access to, the records of the involved agency. So I don't see an issue or difficulty in us getting that, in us making clear to the public and to anyone reading our report what those policies were at the time, what that officer was supposed to be doing at the time, and we'll be able to make it clear what that officer did. I think it's also important, and will probably be included in our reports, for folks to know that a violation of policy doesn't necessarily lead to a criminal charge. It might be relevant to certain parts of a criminal charge, but simple violation of policy does not necessarily equal a crime.
Another kind of point of clarification. What if, as happened recently in Thurston County, there is a police pursuit, law enforcement pursuit that results in somebody's death?
It depends on the circumstances of the pursuit and how it ended. We are authorized to conduct investigations of police use of deadly force. So if in conducting that pursuit, an officer uses deadly force to stop the pursuit and that leads to someone's death, we will investigate it. If it's
The
not
person crashes
100%,
and dies, and it was just while they were being chased, that's different.
probably. It'll depend on the circumstances. And I think, one thing that we want to do initially is be a little bit more inclusive. And so if it's not 100% clear whether the officer used deadly force, I think one of the things we will investigate is whether that was a use of deadly force.
Well, and you could, one can spin all sorts of scenarios here, but, and to be clear, this wasn't the case
Please
here.
go ahead.
But you could imagine in those, so somebody could crash while being pursued and die, and that happened. You could also have somebody, a police officer, use a pit maneuver to force a car off the road, and usually those happen at lower speeds. But if somebody died in that situation, maybe that would be.
Depending on the circumstances, or I guess the more extreme is that the officer just rams them and doesn't really do a pit maneuver. So it just depends on the circumstances and what happened.
So in the few minutes we have left, I want to ask you about this recurring proposal to also stand up an Office of Independent Prosecution to look at these cases outside of the county prosecutors. The county prosecutors have pushed back on this. Some family members have said the flaw they see in this is now we have a state office doing independent investigations, but are going to hand that back off now to local prosecutors who may have relationships and will have relationships in proximity to the agency involved. And so they feel like it's one step forward, again, putting some words in people's mouth here. But that's my impression, is that criticism has been kind of one step forward, two steps back. Do you have an opinion about this? Do you think in order for this, what you're creating to work well, it would be good to sort of hook it to an independent prosecution system?
What I've said consistently is that I think it would be nice for our agency to have one centralized place to provide our cases. I was a prosecutor. I understand the argument on the other side that I was, as a prosecutor, I was elected by this county to handle the cases that occur in this county. This is one of the cases that occurs in my county. It should be my job to do it. I would say, however, that if you go to King County or if you go to Pierce County and you ask them about how difficult it is to prosecute an officer from an agency that you have to work with on a regular basis, that they will tell you in an honest moment that it's not easy and that there are a lot of issues that crop up and that it would be a lot easier if they could put it somewhere else. And I think that my guess is that the agencies who have had to deal with it are probably more likely to want an independent prosecutor than those who don't.
Do you see a path to this, given the pushback that county prosecutors have put up so far?
So, Austin, one of the things that I got hired to do was because I have some credibility in the criminal legal system, and I'm a former prosecutor, former judge, and I know about investigations, I know about what these cases look like. I think I bring some credibility to this work. What I'm not is a politician, and I don't know how that works. Right. I don't know whether there's a good chance it happens or doesn't.
Okay. Less than a minute left. You said last year that you could sort of see it now, essentially. You've stood up enough of this agency to see that. What would you say heading towards this December 1st? If you could see it now a year ago, what would you say?
The main thing I would say is that we have hired really incredible investigators to do this work. I mean, I wish I could sit here and kind of go through each person that we've hired, because each of them came into their interviews and was really able to describe why they want to do this work and why they want to do it in a way that makes a difference. And some of them have been former law enforcement, some of them have never been, but they all want to do the same thing and they want to do it well. And I am looking forward to seeing them do the work.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Roger Rogoff, the Director of the Office of Independent Investigations. Thanks for coming back and doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.